Israel and their attacks on Hezbollah and their attacks on Hamas, obviously taking out really the top leadership in Hezbollah over the weekend. But of course, our own officials couldn't waste a moment to not, of course, were they celebrating? We took out 30-year terrorist? No, of course, they're putting out statements like this. And this is from Rashida Tlaib. It says, the Biden-Harris administration continues to allow Netanyahu and the Israeli government to operate with impunity as they carry out war crimes. After facing no red line in Gaza and an attempt to remain in power, Netanyahu is now expanding his genocidal campaign to Lebanon, using the same tactics the Biden-Harris administration has endorsed. We've already seen indiscriminate acts on civilian infrastructure. We've seen Israel officials falsely declare that Lebanon isn't a state and that Israel has a right to invade and occupy it. The U.S. weapons being used to kill innocent civilians in Gaza. They've already claimed the lives of over 500 people in Lebanon, including over 50 children, thousands more civilians. It goes on to say President Biden must implement an immediate arms embargo to end the slaughter and de-escalate the risk of a wider regional war. That, again, is coming from one of our own elected officials.
The congresswoman from Michigan is now deciding that this is the time to really stand up for the terrorist organizations, as we've seen terrible language from them ever since really a couple weeks after October 7th, whenever Israel started to respond to that horrendous attack that was conducted against the Israeli people. Now, when you hear something like that, at a time also when you're just, days away really from an election, we're just almost at a month. We'll be at a month in just a few days from the general election, knowing the problems that Joe Biden had with the community in Michigan that is represented by Congresswoman Tlaib. You have to wonder what pushback she's getting within her own community right now to put statements out like this. You'd think that something that hypercritical of an administration would not be stated at this exact time. Basically claiming that the current sitting vice president and president of the United States, their policies are furthering genocide.
But of course, if you don't support Israel at all, which they do not, if they have no feelings or support of them being able to defend themselves, of course they're not going to like the most recent actions, which really, does it escalate? Of course it's escalating. But it's escalating to the point of now, I'd say a point of no return. You have your head of Hezbollah being taken out. You have Hamas very weak. This is time for Benjamin Netanyahu's Israeli government to probably finish the job, to go in there and take care of what they've needed to take care of for decades. I think he believes he is the person to do it. Their administration is the one to do it. And look, I'm not saying it's not even controversial in Israel. There's some people in Israel who have problems with this. There's just as many. It's like the same as here. It's like half and half, liberals and conservatives. But a lot of them do believe in fighting for their own country. Because even we could see in the New York Times, it was the obituary, I guess you'd say, for the head of Hezbollah, Nasrallah. They put on there a statement that talked about how, he was actually a pretty, though he was pretty conservative in his views, he did seek for a peaceful country where all people could live together. Of course, that country could not involve the state of Israel.
That's right. This is from the headline, Protesters Mourn Nasrallah's Death Around the World. Meanwhile, I'm seeing celebrations around the world at Nasrallah's death.
Maybe one of the most uplifting moments was after he was even presumed dead, before they even had confirmed it. There was uprisings in the streets in Syria, in Lebanon, in America, in UK, in front of the Israeli, in Canada, in front of the embassies, thanking Israel for doing this because they've been under extreme rule for decades.
And this is from that third paragraph of that article, Protesters Mourn Nasrallah's Death Around the World. Over his 32 years leading the organization and with the support of Iran, he built Hezbollah into a domestic political force and one of the most heavily armed non-state forces in the world. Mr. Nasrallah was opposed to Israel, which he called the Zionist entity, and maintained that there should be one Palestine with equality for Muslims, Jews, and Christians. A powerful orator, he was beloved among many Shiite Muslims and historically marginalized group in the Arab world, and created a state within a state in Lebanon that provided social services. What a great guy, according to the New York Times.
I don't understand why we're doing this. I don't understand why every time a terrorist leader is taken out or a dictator, is taken out, there's this weird apology from, it feels like, the mainstream press, whether that's the AP, whether that is the New York Times. It happens over and over again, to a point where you do start looking towards, I'm glad we exist, I'm glad other broadcasts exist, because that wasn't even the mainstream view of this. As you said, Will, the mainstream view of this was the world is lucky to be rid of him. The President Biden, put out a statement essentially saying that. Of course, they don't say thank you to Israel, but they do say, he was a horrible guy who murdered endless amounts of people, of his own people, that even people of the Muslim faith disagreed with because of the way that they're sectioned, that certain Muslims were not even, they were even celebrating this moment. This wasn't just a moment for Christians and Jews to be excited. This is a moment their own people felt liberated. But of course, our own press, our own New York Times, has to go out there and start making these kind of statements. It's really sad. As we saw Nasrallah taken out, and then other leaders from Hezbollah, people who have been plaguing that region of the world for decades. But of course, we have statements coming out of places like the New York Times in his essentially obituary saying, over his 32 years leading the organization, he built Hezbollah into a domestic political force, one of the most heavily armed non-state forces in the world. Mr. Nasrallah was opposed to Israel, which he called the Zionist entity, but maintained there should be one Palestine with equality for Muslims, Jews, and Christians. Is that how you remember him, Jeff? And what do you think about these kind of statements? Because I feel like this isn't even the reaction around the world. We are seeing people in the streets celebrating. We are seeing these moments happen, but our own country, at some reason, the New York Times and these kind of places have to come out with these kind of statements.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, it makes me want to see an obituary for the New York Times. That publication has turned so foul. Evil is good and good is evil. Nasrallah was a purely evil person. Nasrallah spent his life dedicated to one thing and one thing only: the genocide of the Jews. In the process of that, he trampled the Christian Lebanon into obliteration. Essentially, a country that was once the most beautiful place on the Mediterranean, a magnificent country where all faiths lived together in peace. And they came in there as Iranian proxies, and they destroyed life, made it miserable for everybody. And he spent his life dedicated to pure evil. And here comes the New York Times trying to find some way to praise him. Again, the New York Times has been consistent in their campaign of incitement against the existence of not just Israel, but also against Jews. Even in America, the New York Times is known for hiding news about violent anti-Semitism, for praising those who are the enemies of the Jews. It's a terrible publication. The bigger issue, which you and Will talked about before, and I was watching, this is a celebration, as you say, around the Middle East. This is from Syria to Lebanon to Iran. Those who want to see peace, those who want to see freedom, are celebrating the destruction of this evil, evil man who actually was directly responsible and has been part of an organization that has been a terrorist faction that has destroyed countless lives in the region and many, many American lives, American servicemen's families. They've just obliterated them. Thank God that he's been taken out.